Hello again, friends. What if I were to say Tipper? What would you think of? Well, I suppose by the title of the video you probably already know what this is about, so that kind of throws that idea off. If I were to say Tipper Gore, most people would think of Al Gore's wife, if anything. But those of us who grew up in the 80s have a completely different memory of this time. Tipper Gore, of course, was Al Gore's wife, who was very appalled by the language and the music in the current music industry in the 1980s. And the PMRC, this group that decided they were going to assume what was good for the public, was in essence a Christian-based group of people who decided they were going to impose their values on the rest of society. And they wanted, at the very least, the parental advisory explicit lyrics sticker, which I'm sure you're all familiar with if you listen to music. Well, these days it's hard to tell because most people don't even buy physical music anymore. But if you still buy records or CDs, that little sticker was put there after a long fight in court to make sure that the poor little children in their ears weren't harmed by this music. Now let me say this, I was born in 1975. I grew up through the 80s. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, I discovered my first heavy metal album. And it was Wasp, of all things. Now, Wasp is a heavy metal band which was very absurd. They dressed like wild animals, they acted like fools, they had blood on their covers. And the particular album that was a major controversy was called Animal, Fuck Like a Beast. Now, many of these album covers eventually had to have the explicit sticker as well as self-censor in order for them to be available within, let's say Walmart was actually the first store in the 80s to stop carrying many of these albums because they were facing so much pressure from these groups to not carry them. So for example, Poison, there's an album, Open Up and Say Ah, and it has a picture of this guy with a really long tongue. They had to put black boxes around it. So the original versions of the album are actually worth some money, well, some of the bands. I don't know about Poison so much. I used to have one of the original ones, but Wasp was very absurd. They weren't the only band. I mean, the interesting thing is that most people never listened to the entirety of the lyrics. These people would just stand up there and pander to the public saying, oh, look, your kids are getting damaged and it was this God or music attitude. And there were actually groups who would say that, and there were many churches at the time who would say, tell their people that you have to decide between rock music and God, as if it's music somehow is preventing you from being closer to your religion. But I can understand at the time they were probably appalled by some of the music, but the ones that they called out were preposterous and sometimes taken out of context. Much of the time taken out of context. I listened to Slayer when I was a kid, and I still do, and Slayer was taken as a satanic band, for example. They weren't even on the hot seat during that time. But Slayer was playing a role. They were never Satanists. The thing is, most people looked at these bands and thought, wow, they must be in some deep occult thing. They were putting on a mask in order to sell a product. Now, Black Sabbath in the 70s started much of this. They were what I consider the kings of heavy metal, the root of heavy metal, and the first heavy metal band. Black Sabbath was phenomenal, but Ozzy was always misunderstood. The thing with the biting the head off a bat, there are a ton of stories about rock stars that were just, crude and rude. Well, the more of these stories that came up, the more attention these artists got. Therefore, these artists learned that if you're going to resist us, then we're going to put even more of this shit in our music. We're going to make it even more crude, and our lyrics will be even worse. And they weren't even that bad at the time. They were quoting bands like Kiss. Now, the band Kiss, no offense to any Kiss fans out there, they were ass clowns. They were complete morons. They had no real interest in the music. Gene Simmons has admitted to this day that he just wanted to make money. That was his whole thing. And so Gene Simmons is probably one of the biggest douchebags that I've ever seen after watching the shows and the things that he's put out in interviews. It's would be pretty embarrassing for any Kiss fan to realize what an actual douchebag he is. That's my opinion. But it's okay. It's his thing. He's all about the money, right? Well, the stuff was offensive for the sake of profit, is what I'm saying. There are some bands out there who are very dark. And I'm not doubting that there are probably some satanic bands as well in the black metal realm. But back then, no. Everybody was playing a game. Twisted Sister was called out. And I'll tell you, one of the most beautiful things was the PMRC Congress meeting where they interviewed Dee Snider. And he was the Twisted Sister head man. And they asked him, well, what is you have this SMF of Twisted Sister, what does that mean? And he goes, oh, it's the sick motherfucking friends of Twisted Sister. He was straight up, and he's like, look, Dee Snider is awesome. He's one of the most well-spoken, fucking cool people out there, which just turned out to was one of the biggest dorks the way he dressed back then, but I loved Twisted Sister. Anyhow, it wasn't just him, though. It wasn't just the metal, the rockers. Fucking John Denver was at that same hearing, speaking for the freedom of speech and freedom of music. Do you think John Denver's music is offensive? No. He's a musician who understood the implications of trying to stifle free speech. So the idea was that they convinced everybody that all these band members were satanic and occult members, and so they would say, all right, cool, we'll take that and run with it because it makes more money, gets more record sales, gets us more interviews with Circus and Metal Edge magazine, which probably haven't heard of those unless you were in the 80s either. I think one of the most absurd aspects to come out of this was the Stairway to Heaven played in reverse. And most people have heard of this. It's called backmasking, I believe, is what they called it. They said that bands were putting satanic messages in their music backwards. And in Stairway to Heaven, if you play it backwards, if I get around to it, I might upload a video I made showing this. I did it, put it on my record player, and I spun it in reverse. But there's plenty of cuts of it out there on YouTube, I'm sure. It's supposed to say, "My sweet Satan," if you play it backwards. Just this one part. Well, let me tell you, if you're some idiot looking for any excuse to hate on a band, and you want to spend the time to actually play a record by hand backwards to try to find messages, pareidolia, I guess apophenia, kicks in, where you're basically trapped in this illusion of connections that don't exist, and you're hearing things. And it's a form of delusion in a way to think that Led Zeppelin would actually include "My Sweet Satan" of all things in their music. But you hear what you want to hear. So after that, a lot of bands actually started doing backmasking on purpose, just to fuck with people. And my message here is that simple. The more you resist freedom of speech, the freedom to express yourself, the more people are going to be extreme. The more you try to suppress art, the more people are going to show art. The more you try to ban sex from television, people are going to show it. And the same thing in sex and music. If you look at the music of today and the kind of things people get away with, it just makes the music and the lyrics of the 80s just look like nothing in comparison. The things they said were just so mild and weren't even really that bad. Bands like Suicidal Tendencies, that was one of my favorite bands to skate to. And sure, the idea of suicidal tendencies, that was always taken out of context. The idea is the dude had depression, he had issues, he had problems, he went to a psych ward, he sung about being institutionalized. Regardless of where you come from, people are going to sing about their own experiences. And if you don't want it, I guess that's where Gene Simmons was smart. He said, if you don't like it, then go out and buy 1,000 copies of my album and burn them. That was one of the only smart things he ever said. But then again, that's financially motivated, right? So, music doesn't cause suicide or murder. And this is something that a lot of the 80s, a lot of these parents groups really push the idea that this kid killed himself while listening to AC/DC, or this kid listened to this band and killed himself. Music doesn't influence us to be a certain person. We listen to music that reflects the person that we feel like we are. So if you're depressed, you're going to tend to listen to depressing music. If you're happy, you're going to listen to happy music. This is something that people who don't know music just don't understand. When I'm feeling low, I'll listen to low music, but it doesn't cause me to feel low. It's not telling me to harm myself. It's just, if a person already feels that way, they're going to. So those who are suffering seek out music that represents how they feel. And that's... So, what else was there? After NWA came out with Fuck the Police, it pretty much changed everything. That was one of the biggest controversies out there. The idea was that they were inspiring people to go out and shoot officers, and they basically said, we don't care what you think. And that was the tipping point where rap and R&B and rock just started to basically do whatever they wanted, and the rest is history. So I guess I just wanted to present how we got to where we are, from My Sweet Satan in reverse on Led Zeppelin to people cussing about killing pretty much everybody. I mean, some of the rappers of today, I haven't heard any rap in a long time that was meaningful. And it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to the people who understand it, but it's not meaningful to a wide audience like some music was when I was younger. And I'm not doing the age thing where I'm like, oh, the music of today, because I'm always listening to new music, trying to find bands I like. And it was just different when we were younger. And that's what was funny. The music was fun in the 80s. And they took it so seriously. And look what happened. It just became more serious. Anyway, those are my thoughts on 80s music and the PMRC and the whole advisory thing. And that's how we got to where we are. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. I guess it doesn't matter. I'm just reporting from my viewpoint. So, be well, my friends.